ladies and gentlemen, friends of PISAI, on behalf of the staff members and professors of PISAI, I welcome you all. This is the second public lecture in our annual cycle. The first, if you remember, focused upon the question of mercy in the Islamic tradition. This second lecture is in some ways connected to the first, because it concentrates on a well-known quranic phrase, la ikrāha fil-Dīn, there is no compulsion in religion, now often quoted both in Christian and in Muslim fields of study. Those who study the Quran and its commentaries, the tafsir, know that this verse has been given many interpretations. This evening we will hear one in particular. Both the one who gave it and the one who offers the lecture are related to Shia Islam, a minority compared to the Sunni, but certainly no less interesting. The interpretation is from the great philosopher Mullā Ṣadrā Shīrāzī, who lived between our 16th and 17th centuries, between the current Iran and Iraq, and among whose numerous works is also a work of tafsir. Our lecture tonight is presented by Dr. Sajjad Rizvi, Director of the Institute of Arab and Islamic Studies at the University of Exeter in the United Kingdom. Dr. Rizvi is a renowned specialist in the life and works of Mulla Sadra, to whom he dedicated his PhD thesis. He is also profoundly interested in the field of quranic exegesis and hermeneutics. He is currently completing 3 projects: an intellectual history of philosophy in Iran and North India, on the cusp of colonialism, an analysis of the noetics of Mulla Sadra, and a short monograph on Mir Damad. His next major projects are mapping Islamic philosophical traditions in India from 1450 to 1850, and writing an intellectual history of apophasis in Islamic thought. We are very grateful to Professor Rizvi for his kindness in accepting to talk to us tonight about this very interesting topic. And now, Professor, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Thank you all for coming. Thank you for the invitation. I apologize if now and then my voice might break up a bit. I'm suddenly feeling quite allergic to my surroundings. I'm not quite sure what's happened since I've moved this morning from Istanbul. I'm going to be talking about something which is quite well known. This particular verse which Valentina has mentioned, and then after an introduction where I look at how this has been presented, particularly in modernist Muslim thought, I will move on to a slightly different take on this particular fragment of the verse from Mulla Sadra in the 17th century, from his tafsir, which I think sheds some very interesting light on what he considers the nature of religion to be, and what sort of a sapiential context in which to place the notion of religion. I won't read completely, but now and then I will, just to keep myself to the text. One of the mainstays of modernist Muslim discourse is the accommodation of a broadly liberal notion of religious freedom. The freedom to choose one's religion and to leave one's religion if necessary, including Islam. Although, of course, the question of apostasy is far more complicated than that. This position is usually predicated upon a scriptural argument that isolates the famous phrase from Quran, chapter 2, verse 256, Baqarah 256, as the proof text that demonstrates this. There is no compulsion, no coercion in religion. Righteousness has become manifestly clear from error. This phrase is seen as mandating a clear principle that the Quran requires true faith to be based on free choice and will. To take one example, in the famous manifesto of progressive Muslims, issued in the immediate aftermath of 9/11, Amir Hussain put forward an argument for pluralism that was rooted in social exigency, but also in the Quranic mandate of this verse. The paradox of a missionary faith eschews forced conversion it does elicit Hussein's comment, but the fact for him is clear. This Quranic phrase provides a program for pluralism and not just a recognition of human diversity. While philosophers of religion talk of pure epistemic pressure, liberals refer to the facts of diversity that need to be celebrated, of celebrating homo religiosus as free and unfettered in her choices. It is not just liberals who indulge in a rights-based approach to this Quranic fragment. Muhammad Hashim Kamali, an eminent specialist in Islamic law, begins his approach to human freedom with a discussion of the fundamental ontological status of dignity that is common to all humans. Based on Quran 17:70, we have bestowed dignity upon the children of Adam and conferred our bounties upon them, privileging them above many of our creation. He stresses this critical value: the legal individual and its negative liberty liberties on the principle of harm, the right to personal safety, and to have one's moral character inviolate and preserve moral autonomy is stressed. The Quran further safeguards personal privacy. And this dignity is related to freedom as compulsion violates dignity, and on which Kamali cites precisely this fragment of the verse. Freedom is the principle of human responsibility, of a negative liberty, but also the inviolate nature of moral others, as well as the presumption of permissibility in one's actions in the absence of scriptural and rational prohibition. Freedom of religious choice is therefore part of this, again citing this fragment. And for Kamali, this is a direct divine mandate. On this, interestingly, he cites two classical precedents: the exegesis of Fakhruddin al-Razi, who died in 1210, and Ibn Kathir, who dies a bit more than a century later. And he cites them as arguing for an absolute prohibition on compulsion of religion, because it prohibits, on the basis of the historical context of revelation, any compulsion to embrace Islam. However, Kamali is not being entirely straightforward with this. To argue that there is no compulsion to embrace Islam is not the same as saying that there is no compulsion in religion. And it's quite clear that the medieval exegeses that he's referring to do not refer to the latter, they refer to the former. Kamali's own work on freedom is heavily constrained, with the first half devoted to affirmative evidence and the second to moral and other constraints. So freedom is not unfettered, it is a negative quality, and it has many checks and balances upon them. So this is not a straightforward modern embrace of no compulsion in religion as such, predicated on a divine mandate. Now, in terms of the context and other studies on this particular fragment of the verse, I will mention two academic studies which may well be quite familiar. The first is Johann Friedman's, in a book that he published about 10 years or so ago on tolerance and apostasy in Islamic law. And the other one is an article by Later Islamic, which came out again something like 10 years ago. Friedman in his study suggests that although this phrase has become the locus classicus for discussions of religious tolerance in Islam, the traditions considered it to be a truce verse that might later be abrogated in favor of later jihad and conflict verses, in particular the verses from Surah al-Bara'a, such as the famous or infamous, perhaps we should call it, sword verse. Even if the context suggested a tolerance to those in the Medinan community that remained Jewish or had converted to Christianity before, the question was whether that was a normative mandate. If a command, it did not apply to those who were not people of the books or apostates. An alternative was to see the phrase as articulating a statement of fact and not a normative command, a descriptive as opposed to perhaps a prescriptive ontological statement. The remainder of Friedman's argument considers categories of people who are discussed in the legal traditions as being capable of being forced into Islam. But in all of this, there is little consideration of what one might mean by religion. So fundamentally, I think what Friedman's argument is that the modern usage of this verse to open up the space for freedom is not justified or demonstrated by looking at either the classical exegetical tradition or the classical legal tradition. Patricia Kroner's study is far more extensive and very much focuses on the exegetical tradition. She also examines the phrase, and while acknowledging that most exegetes read it restrictively as a statement of fact, not a mandate, there are some resources in the pre-modern period for a more liberal interpretation. Kroner cites two Mu'tazili views, and I will actually come back to one of these later when I speak about Mulla Sadra. The first concerns the Mu'tazili exegete Abu Muslim al-Isfahani, who died in 934. His exegesis has been fairly recently reconstructed and published. He reads the phrase as advocating free will in the choice of faith and rejecting any divine compulsion for good historic theological reasons. And this view is arguably close to a rights-based one. The second one is of the slightly later Mu'tazili, possibly Zaydi thinker al-Hakim al-Jishumi, who died in 1101, who argues that it entails marking a distinction between matters of faith held as inner states and practices of the moral law performed, an interpretation which actually became quite commonplace in medieval Shi'i exegesis, such as the works of Tusi and Tabrisi in the 11th and 12th century. The challenge is that if there is no compulsion, how can there be an apostasy law and even jihad? This is a fundamental problem which arises. Thank you. One particular liberal response which we might look at is to consider that even if apostasy is sinful, it does not necessarily entail a punishment. And similarly, an argument that jihad as an act of violence is something which is purely defensive. And we find these views have been articulated by modernists at least since the 19th century, and there are a number of examples of this. But again, there is little on the nature of religion that is not being compelled. Now, in terms of the exegesis of Mulla Sadra, I was first sort of made aware of this through the final section of Christian Jean-Bé's L'Acte, which is a study of his on the philosophy of Mulla Sadra, which came out in 2002. Towards the section on salvation or the return to the One, Jean-Bé discusses the nature of the divine theophany in the form of the throne and the perfect human, culminating with a short discussion of no compulsion in religion that forms its logical conclusion. The perfect human, al-insan al-kamil, is the goal of creation moving towards God. The microcosmic homology, alam saghir, of God, who manifests the totality of the divine names and has always existed and always will. Incidentally, this is, I'm presenting what Jean-Bé says. This is not a direct quotation from Mulla Sadra. In fact, the return of the cosmos to the One is mediated through the person and the reality of the perfect human. Becoming such a person requires certainty and pureness of the heart, which is the organ and reality that is the seat of the divine and the human, the homology of the divine throne. Referring to the commentary of Mulla Sadra on Hadith number 333 in the Book of Divine Unity in al-Kafi of Khulaini, one of the classical, what were later called 4 books of Shi'i Hadith, Jombe comments on the meaning of the divine throne bearing 4 columns of light and being borne by 4 angels. These correspond to the 4 levels or worlds emanating from the One, as well as the faculties in the human and the realization on the path of wisdom. The heart encompasses God and the cosmos, but it is also the organ of consciousness. Through realizing this, one understands the 4 degrees of consciousness that unfold, corresponding to the 4 columns of light, and indeed the 4 angels. The level of divine providence, that is the simple and undifferentiated knowledge of the essence of the divine. The divine decree, that corresponds to the universal intellect and knowledge that exists in the active intellect. The lordly determination, al-Qadr, that corresponds to the level of the universal soul. And finally, on the lowest level, the book of effacement and establishment, which relates to this particular world. Jombe argues that this requires, following Mulla Sadra, complete obedience to this particular divine order. Insofar as religion is an esoteric matter, al-Batini, this is Mulla Sadra's phrase, we'll come back to this, relating to the states of the soul, it is unaffected by exoteric matters, recalling the second Mu'tazili view cited by ikrāha above, distinguishing between the exoteric states of the law, practice and affection, and the esoteric movement of the soul, seeking its origin and its return, achieving annihilation in God. This extinction cannot be achieved without complete obedience in response to the desire of the divine love, referring back to the famous account of the hidden treasure that desired to be known. This, of course, is the standard account for why there is something rather than nothing in the Muslim Neoplatonic tradition, the famous so-called Hadith Qudsi, where God says, I was a hidden treasure who desired to be known, so I created a creation that I might be known. There are some variations which are interesting about it. We can maybe discuss that later. True liberty, and this recalls a number of critical hadith in al-Kafi, recognizes the complementarity of the exoteric and the esoteric. The soul is existence, and existence subsists and is unconstrained. This is the point where the no compulsion comes in. The harmonious movement of the heart and the soul of the person towards God, what we call religion, cannot be compelled. Now, after this perhaps slightly extensive introduction, let us turn to Mulla Sadra. One of the interesting things about Mulla Sadra is that his approach, and I would argue this is true of a lot of thinkers in the Safavid period, is a holistic approach to knowledge, in the sense that he doesn't necessarily distinguish between works which are purely works of philosophy, or works which are purely works of theology, or even works which are purely works of exegesis, but rather he tends to mix them up quite a lot. Insofar as his major philosophical work, which is called al-Hikmah al-Muta'āliya fil Asfār al-Aqliyya al-Arba'a, the transcendent wisdom articulated in the 4 journeys of the intellect, he discusses and glosses upon many quranic verses and hadith. Similarly, in his exegesis, which is a later work, one of the final works that he wrote towards the end of his life, he has extensive discussions of philosophy. So fundamentally, I think what's quite interesting is that one can see his so-called philosophical work as potentially philosophy as exegesis, and similarly one can see his tafsir potentially as exegesis as philosophy. If we turn to the discussion of Mullā Ṣadrā, he has first a gloss on la ikrāha fid-dīn, and then he has a separate gloss on qad tabayyana ar-rushd min al-ghayy. I'll focus primarily on the first one, and he divides that commentary into 5 sections. And in fact, the structure of this is interesting because it recalls a number of classical exegesis in its particular structure. It's actually a lot more conventional than one might think. So, for example, he begins with an explanation of what the nature of that utterance is, what is the lafz. He moves on to the nature of the meaning, the ma'na, which is expressed. Then he moves on to what is his particular understanding of the verse, and then finally he ends with a consideration of previous exegesis. So structurally, this particular gloss on la ikrāha fid-dīn is very conventional. Now, let me start with the second level, because the discussion of the lafz merely articulates a very straightforward point, which I've already indicated, which is that religion is primarily a transaction or a movement from the believer towards God, and is a universal phenomenon for him. So moving on to the question of what does this mean, and what does religion, and I am rendering Dīn here as religion. Since religion is a matter of submission and contentment that is only realized through warrants pertaining to intellectual beliefs that God causes to enter the hearts of those who are contented in their faith, and that faith is also entreated through acts of submission that invite this inner revelation and certainty, then it is clear that there can be neither compulsion nor coercion in this matter. One cannot force something on the inner states of the person, and this is what Mulla Sadra says. This is because religion is an esoteric matter, amr batini. It is only the true one, and none other, who can have dominion over the esoteric aspect of the human and his heart through what is appropriate to it, through spiritual intimacies, ecstatic experiences, inner revelations that are desired, and divine self-disclosures. And in this context, he cites a couple of hadith which are commonly cited in Sufi contexts about the nature of God's intervention and dominion over both the exoteric and esoteric aspects of the individual, and particularly a very interesting hadith which says that religion is mere tamanna. The word uses tamanna, which I will, in a preliminary manner, rather weakly translate as wish. I was struggling with how to translate tamanna. Maybe you can suggest a better one. He glosses this particular thing further. Tamanna, wish, is a type of will. So how can it be obtained through force, which is compulsion? Religion is the submitting of oneself to the commands of the law exoterically, and submission to the qualities of the truth esoterically, without any esoteric harm. The third level, or the third section, moves on to the mystical trope of the ascent to God, as well as the Mu'tazili theological theme of facilitating grace. Once God has elaborated on the beauties of true monotheism, it would be improper not to provide the ways for the seeker to achieve it. This is the classic Mu'tazili doctrine of divine grace. The phrase indicates the status of being pleased, maqam al-rida, and contentment with God, which is the status of the truly sincere and the Gnostic, al-arifin, as-siddiqin. This is the means by which God facilitates the ability of the morally obliged to fulfill their obligations. Of course, not everyone attains this status immediately or indeed ever. Many follow their whims and desires, worship their desires indeed, and fail to recognize the true nature of reality that God has produced and informed us about. Therefore, the hate or reluctance to submit to God is a failure to recognize what God has proposed to us, as well as an inability to see the nature of the reality of things as they truly are. However, if humans are willing to attain the status of pleasure and contentment with God, they need to hold on to hope, raja, be prepared for trials, jafa, seek shelter in patience, sabr, and fulfill their requirement to thank the benefactor, ni'ma shukr. Once one is attracted towards God, then one attains true Islam, al-Islam al-Haqiqi, and this is a phrase which comes up a number of times, al-Islam al-Haqiqi, al-Iman al-Haqiqi, and its opposite, which is usually al-Dalal al-Haqiqi. That lies in setting aside any annoyance or any reluctance, any coercion. This entails being pleased with what happens and accepting it without coercion. Beyond these established states and stations of the path of the Sufi wayfarer, Mulla Sadra also appeals to the language of annihilation of the self and subsistence in the divine. If there is no independent self and one recognizes this, then the very possibility of any force or compulsion in choosing or changing one's religion cannot possibly obtain. Again, quoting Mulla Sadra. And if one ascends and arrives at the station of pure annihilation and the effacement of all traces, that is the station of the people of absolute oneness, not divine unity or union. He does not revert to the stage of pleasure and contentment. His stage is that of being a servant and of holding pure sincerity. He purifies himself from thinking he has independent subsistence, such that he may be qualified with perfection, kamal, or from having an identity such that he is qualified by the qualities of majesty and beauty, qualities, of course, of God. At this point, there is neither wayfaring nor wayfarer, neither arriving at nor arriver. For God is the goal, and to your Lord all things revert, which is Quran 96:8. The fourth section takes up the view of Abu Muslim mentioned above that rejects any possibility of compulsion or force, coercion in religion, as faith is a matter of the heart and of being at ease. He criticizes the attempt to distinguish what is legally and ontologically mandated. The very fact of the trials and tribulations of the world, after one has accepted the moral obligation that arises from the acceptance that God exists, and that humans necessarily have a personal relationship with the divine, means that at least in outward matters, in exoteric matters, there is an element of force. Prayers must be performed, fasts conducted, and so forth. And if they are not morally obliged, they can be coerced to do so. But once again, this is, for Mulla Sadra, the state of one who fails to understand the nature of reality. The human spirit, and it's interesting how many times actually Mulla Sadra conflates the term ruh, spirit, with soul in his citation of the Quran, is directly associated with the realm of the divine command. This is a reference to the famous verse, where the Prophet is asked, yas'alunaka an ruh, and God tells him to say, the ruh is min amri rabbi, from the command of my Lord. As such, and due to being directly annexed to God, the spirit of the human does not lie between the options of compulsion and free will, but at the level of pure pleasure. The act that occurs through pleasure as such is such that it is the very volition of God and of love and of desire. The final section in the gloss on al-Dīn reverts back to the exegetical precedents that we have, and these are primarily related to the so-called causes of revelations, or the context of revelation, which are mentioned for this particular phrase. I won't mention most of them because they're not necessarily salient to what I'm saying, but of 5 views that he mentions here, the fifth I think is the most interesting and pertinent to his point. And this is this view. What is meant concerning the religion is not that it is coercion from God, glorified is He, but rather the servant is given free will in this matter. Religion in reality is the actions of the heart when he acts in a particular manner, and if one is coerced to express the two testimonies of faith, the shahadatain, then it is not religion in reality, haqiqatan. Just as one who is coerced to express unbelief while his heart is contented with faith is not an unbeliever. What is intended is the known religion that is Islam and the religion of God with which He is pleased. And this aspect is closest to what we have discussed above. So this is clearly his preferred interpretation from the various precedents which have come. And it's quite interesting that here he is, in a sense, further defining his notion of religion as being an internal matter by referring to the opposite, which is basically how it is that one may hide one's true faith by outwardly expressing disbelief but inwardly holding it close to one's heart. Now this is further elaborated in an element of his gloss on the following phrase, righteousness has become manifestly clear from error, in which he reverts to his main interpretation but contrasts true belief with true disbelief, and considers religion to be the link in the path that is traversed to God. Again, I quote Mulla Sadra: "Since it has been mentioned that religion cannot obtain through coercion, this establishes a norm that glosses its essence." And He, God, says, "Indeed, righteousness has become manifestly clear from error." That is, He has made clear and revealed what was mentioned before, from examples of what is known, that true religion, al-Dīn al-Haqiqi, is traversing the path to God and passing through stages that come between the servant and his Lord, that are called righteousness and guidance, away from true error, al-Dalal al-Haqiqi, which is traversing the path of Satan and one's caprice, and which is known as error and misguidance. The last element of Mulla Sadra's commentary on this critical section of the verse relates to a turn towards how rejection of coercion and the clear nature of error and clear nature of guidance, error, privileges the human over all others that revert to God. Note that while he was perfectly aware of the Aristotelian notion of the privilege of the human lies in the excellence of his rational soul, he goes beyond such an interpretation. He begins with this. For example, he says this phrase distinguishes truth from falsehood and belief from unbelief, as entailed by proofs and clear indicators and clear demonstrations after reflection and contemplation upon these proofs and demonstrations. The distinction he's making here relates to that between a follower, a muqallid, and we know from his other work, particularly from the Asfar, that he has little to say which is positive about taqlid in intellectual matters. In fact, he strongly rejects it. And someone who has attained gnosis, that is a stage beyond accepting belief in religion. So ma'rifah is beyond i'tiqad for him. The latter is the recipient of a providential esoteric opening of the heart, al-inshirah al-ba'tani, and the boon of witnessing the reality of belief and not just the letter of it. Crucially for Mulla Sadra, this involves the inculcation of this potentiality through the teaching of a Gnostic sage and the spiritual exercises of disciplining the body, As a result of this providential gift and the training of the sage, quote, "The human soul is distinguished above all animal souls that may not have a reversion to the One, and those wretched ones who fall short in their obedience on the path but do have an afterlife. Following the perfected ones, even in purely formal aspects, by stripping the soul away from the filth of attachment and ugly actions, and purifying the heart from what is annexed to it. In inclining towards the agent origin al-mabda al-fa'al with a sincere intention and pure agency entails that the follower shares in the felicity of the afterlife and its illustrious pleasures that are particular to the Gnostics. True felicity follows true Gnosis. In fact, it is the very thing itself. Where there is no independence in Gnosis, there is no independent felicity. According to the rule that one who resembles a people is one of them, his resemblance to the perfected ones, insofar as he resembles them, is the hint of the felicity to come. This is quite important. This is very much an element of how he understands philosophy, which I'll come to towards the end, that philosophy is fundamentally a particular way of life. It's a practice. It's a set of spiritual practices which involves living in a particular type of community and following the guidance of a particular sage who has accomplished much on this particular path and has seen these realities and known these realities. Now, to an extent it could be argued that it is difficult to see how Mulla Sadra ultimately overcomes this Mu'tazili distinction between the ontological mandate and the social legislative reality. If anything, his is a far more systematically elitist conception. Those who are not accomplished philosophers or even sages can be coerced through the dictates of the exoteric law once they have decided to take on the moral obligation of the faith. And also this does seem to fall within the context of Islam, although he has very little, if in fact nothing, to say about the nature of apostasy. And I think to a certain extent his neglect of the issue of apostasy is simply a reflection that for him it is quite inconceivable that someone would reject Islam, because it would be entirely contrary to the sound intellect for an individual to forsake the faith once she has accepted it. Nevertheless, the conception of religion as an esoteric reality is quite a stark one that links clearly to his conception of philosophy as a way of life and the pursuit of wisdom. To illustrate this, as a way of conclusion, let us turn to another text that Mulla Sadra puts forward a more universalistic understanding of religion, at least for the elite who have perfected their human reality, and continues this theme of philosophy as a way of life and a spiritual commitment and practice. In his treatise on the incipience of the cosmos, Hudud al-Alam, towards the end where he turns to the theologically sensitive problem of the corporeal inception of the cosmos, basically the problem of creatio ex nihilo, one of the issues upon which Ghazali anathematized the philosophers for failure to uphold it, or rather for rejecting it. A small aside, one of the interesting features of philosophy in the Safavid period, I think, and this I suspect is also true of the Ottoman thinkers, is a direct desire to respond to Ghazali's famous 3 charges of unbelief against philosophers. The 3 charges being that the philosophers think that the cosmos is eternal, that the philosophers deny that God knows particulars, and that the philosophers deny corporeal resurrection. These are 3 issues which philosophers in the Ottoman and Safavid period go to great lengths to actually demonstrate is not the case, but rather to actually attempt to provide rational proofs for the theological doctrines. Anyway, in this text he argues in the following on this particular point. From what we have mentioned and demonstrated about the nature of the corporeal inception of the cosmos, concerning both celestial and other bodies, it is the very doctrine of the verifiers of every nation, of every past and subsequent confession. Because all those divine wayfarers and monotheists have a singular religion and path, Dīn wāḥid wa maslak, in its foundations and principles of belief and states of the origins and the return, and the reversion of all things to him, glorified is he. Do you not see that the religions of all the prophets and their successors and their followers are one, as there is no difference of opinion among them transmitted from them in matters of the gnosis of things divine, except for what pertains to different practices and political exigencies that differ according to their contexts? And for one whose religion is not the religion of the prophets, and there's a quite clear suggestion that this doesn't really exist, because all religions ultimately have an association with a particular prophet, and has no wisdom, hikmah, in any matter, he is not considered among the sages, and is not rooted in the gnosis of realities. The sage is that one who knows things as they truly are, among the states of the origins and the return, and the nature of the procession of existence from God, and the nature of their reversion to him. The former is known as the knowledge of divine unity and of metaphysics, and the latter is known as the knowledge of prophecies and the knowledge of the soul. This gnosis, in its two divisions, is the wisdom that has come down in divine recognition, indicating its greatness and the glory of its people. He who is given wisdom is given a great good. Quran 2:269. It is one of the greatest bounties and boons, the most illustrious of gifts, the most noble of treasures and felicities of the human soul. By it, wisdom, are the higher and lower worlds sustained, and the ecstasies of all existence obtained. It is only through wisdom that one gains felicity, and it is only through opposition to it that one becomes wretched. So make an effort, dearly beloved, to acquire what the prophets have indicated in the scriptures revealed from the highest precinct, and what sages have expounded in their scrolls and books about the most noble goal, and the issues hidden from those who are not worthy of them. The greatest doctrine of the greatest sages and their communities, and he's basically saying that the doctrine of all the sage communities and the prophets is they agree on these incipients of the cosmos. And it's because these individuals, the sages and their communities, were witnessed to be the best of their place and time in their precedence and excellence, and the exemplars of each confession attested to their asceticism and the purity of their consciences, and their shunning of sensualities, and their withdrawal from the worldly, and their reversion to their original abode, and their resemblance to the principles and their acquisition of the moral qualities of the Creator. One of the key features of a sage is that the sage is someone who has accomplished theosis, has become like God. The term in Arabic is allo. And so, given that they're like that, because they are recognized for their piety, for their practices, if you want to be like this, if you want to understand this, then you have to be part of that particular community. And the singularity of this true religion, therefore, for Mulla Sadra is directly associated by him with the singularity of the prophetic origins of wisdom and the attested doctrine of the true sages that live in communities and practice philosophy as a way of life. I think the main there's two things I think you can maybe take away from this, just as including a couple of remarks. The first is that, as we've said a number of times, religion is primarily an internal matter, it's an esoteric matter. And religion is a universalist reality. Given that is the case, conversion from one religion to the other makes absolutely no sense. It is of no meaning. Because fundamentally, at an esoteric level, if one is an accomplished sage and a practitioner of religion, there can be no distinction between the practices of different confessions. However, the other point which relates to his conception of freedom is that there is a fundamental distinction to be drawn between those who are an elite, for which this is a true ontological status and mandate, and for those who have not quite accomplished this. And where those other individuals are concerned, there are elements of coercion that can be brought to bear. The extent of that is rather unclear. I think it would be highly unlikely for Mulla Sadra to reject all the elements of the exoteric law that were available at his time and were practiced, quite simply because he still lived within a particular imperial context in which Islam was supreme. But at the same time, there is a very clear distinction he's making between an elite conception of religion as such and a non-elite conception of religions. And I think I should stop there. Thank you.
Thanks, Professor Rizvi, for your interesting and very scholarly lecture. Now it's time for questions.